Okay, we are ready to welcome our panel now, because for just more than a year, our lives have been, completely transformed. And apart from the upheaval in every sphere of our day-to-day lives, this pandemic has certainly revealed that something maybe that we've known all along, that our normal, maybe it was already dysfunctional and our systems were already at a breaking point, and the gaps between the haves and the have-nots, or the never were intended to haves, that has grown into deep chasms of inequality and injustice as well. So as we head into the second year of living kind of topsy-turvy, we have a remarkable opportunity here. Through this, we can reimagine our futures, reconceive our possibilities, defy a return to normality under the terms and conditions that we had previously endured or tolerated. Author and activist Arundhati Roy has described the pandemic as a portal. So this is a gateway between one world and the next. And in moving through this portal, Roy offers us an evocatively stark choice. Just listen to this. Close your eyes, whatever, but just listen to what Roy wrote. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and our hatred, our avarice, our data banks, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Isn't that perfect? It is simply perfect for this evening and for always. Now, over this last year, staff at West Coast Leaf have been working to reimagine these other worlds, thinking about what opportunities are emerging from these seeds of possibility. But before we get to that point, we have to actually believe that it is possible to grow something, that this soil can be cultivated, and that the conditions are going to support and uplift, new ways of being, new ways of doing and making. So this evening, we have with us three remarkable artists to engage us in reimagining these new pathways to achieving the futures that we desire. So through various media, photography, poetry, filmmaking, they are storytellers. And their works are expressions of personal power and springboards for building solidarity in community. So we've invited them here to share their work and their visions of futures that don't simply replicate where we've been, but actually transform how we think and where we can go together. We are delighted to be joined this evening by Elle Jones, by Jules Arita Kustachen, and by Kaylee Spitzer. Let me tell you a little bit about each one of them. And definitely, this is only a very small part of their story. Elle Jones is a spoken word poet, an educator, journalist, and community activist living in African Nova Scotia. Now, she was the 5th poet laureate of Halifax. And in 2016, Elle was a recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her community work and work in prison justice. She is co-founder of the Black Power Hour. It's a live radio show with incarcerated people that creates space for people inside to share their creative work, discuss contemporary social and political issues. Okay, that's a little bit about Elle. Now, Jules Arita Kustachen is Inu Isqueyu, Swampy Cree woman, a band member of Attawapiskat First Nation, located in what is now called Northern Ontario. She is the mother of 4 incredible sons, a published writer, performance artist, an academic, an award-winning filmmaker. So she's currently completing her PhD with the Institute of Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice program at the University of British Columbia. And her research is focused on Indigenous documentary practices. Kaylee Spitzer is a photographer whose work embraces the stories of contemporary BIPOC, queer and trans bodies, creating representation that is self-determined. And Kaylee's collaborative process is informed by the desire to rewrite visual histories of Indigenous bodies beyond a colonial lens. Kaylee is Cascadena from Davlin, Lower Post, BC, on her father's side, and on her mother's side, she is Jewish from Transylvania, Romania. And Kaylee's heritage deeply influences her art, whether through the media of photography or ceramics, tanning hides, or hunting. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that in this discussion. So welcome to Elle, to Jules, and to Kaylee. All right, let's begin with the issue of storytelling and feminism. You know, feminism has a long history of storytelling as consciousness raising. But of course, not all stories and not all experiences have been equally valued or validated, or maybe not even heard in the first place. So I would like to start with Elle, and perhaps you can address this first. Can you speak of the role of self-representation, Elle? Self-representation of yourself or your community in your work. Is telling your own story a meaningful feminist act?
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. And thank you, everybody who's donating. So I'm going to keep pushing this donation. So please keep donating. Thank you so much for having me. I guess just to position myself before I get into storytelling, I come from, my mother is Trinidadian, so from a colonized country. And I come from matriarchy in that until this generation, we only had one boy per generation in my family. My family is all women. And so the history of survival and resistance in my family is very much through the female line. My mother is the youngest sister of her sisters. So her oldest sister is 16 years older than her. And it was through her, she was the first Black woman to integrate the convent school in Trinidad, for example, because she scored so well on the exams, they had to let her into this white school. And the success of really our family coming up from poverty was on her back. When my mother left home at the age of 15, because they didn't offer science for girls, my mother badly wanted to be a scientist and went to live in London by herself. All my aunts and sisters and great aunts and people working as domestics in New York would send her money and say, you know, go buy yourself a coat, go buy yourself boots. And my mother never did anything with it. She was living off apples and coffee. And then when her next sister said, I wish I could go back to school and become a teacher, but I don't have the money, my mom bundled up all that money, sent, you know, $10 from my great aunt working as a nanny, you know, and sent that back to Trinidad. And that's how my family survived. So I was always taught these stories of women's resistance and women's legacies and women's mutual aid within my family. And that has very much influenced. So when we talk about stories of self, I don't think I'm ever really telling stories of self, because I think particularly for Black women, our self is part of a collective. The stories I'm always interested in telling are, I don't want to call them the unseen stories. I don't know. I don't like that language when we say, you know, like give voice to the voiceless, like who made people voiceless, right? Like they have voices. It's just we're not listening to them. But the work I'm most interested in is this work that reveals, I guess, what is actually really glad to see that LEAF is doing work with the child welfare system. This was a case of a child refugee that was brought to Nova Scotia with his sister and was not given citizenship. And when he turned 19, after he'd lived in 31 different homes, the government tried to deport him to Somalia. And that action was led by his sister Fatuma, who also did not have citizenship, who also had a really disgusting history of abuse within the system. She'd been stripped of her hijab. They were put in separate rooms so they could not speak Somali to each other. Fatuma was abused horribly in home after home, and her own children were killed in the child welfare system. One of her children was actually killed when Abdul was arrested by the police. They put him into child welfare, did not care for him, and did not even give him a gravestone or a headstone. So that level of violence is what Fatuma was facing when she led advocacy for her brother Abdul. And Fatuma, at 6 months pregnant on a high-risk pregnancy, stood in front of Justin Trudeau at a town hall in January 2018 in Halifax and asked him, why are you deporting my brother? Would you deport your own son? And stood there and stared down Trudeau and forced him to give an answer to that question. And that sparked really a national movement, not only of Black people that were uprising and saying this is unacceptable, what is happening to Abdul is anti-Blackness in Canada in all its phases, the child welfare system, the youth justice system, the incarceration system, and then the deportation system. But also children in care, who are now suing provinces in Nova Scotia and in Ontario for the neglect that they suffer. So to have a woman like that, I always say Fatuma should be on our money. Fatuma did not have citizenship at the time. She told me years after, I only learned this like this year, that while she was fighting the deportation of her brother, CBSA had come to her and threatened to deport her, even though she had no criminal charges. And she never told me that. Fatuma continues to be entangled in the child welfare system, because as we know, women that go through child welfare and have all kinds of labels in their files, what I call the violence of the paperwork, right? Where these files trace you through life, come and impact your children. So Fatuma has had children seized by child welfare. She has had child welfare continually in her home, in her business. They have continued to harass her. She doesn't have the right documents because of being a refugee, and they continue to deny her things like benefits to live because the name on her SIN does not match the name on her birth certificate, et cetera, et cetera. And through all of that, Fatuma has continued to be the most amazing advocate for children in care. I remember after we had done the advocacy for Abdul, Trudeau was in town, just something else. And I remember Fatuma calling me up and saying, why didn't you tell me? I'd have gone and protested him. Like, she just really got into like protesting Trudeau and was like, we need to protest this. The very next year, we ended up fighting another case of Abdullahi Elmi in the same circumstances. And there was Fatuma speaking out again. Fatuma, who is still, as I said, living in absolutely awful circumstances, will call me up and be like, oh, I heard from somebody that there's a guy in jail and they're trying to deport him. Can you help him? That is what I think of as feminist storytelling. And I've been blessed to be able to tell Fatuma's story. So nothing I'm telling you is out without her permission. So this year, after we had done so much storytelling about Abdul, if you've read Desmond Cole's book, the December chapter of that book actually deals with a lot of our advocacy on the Abdul case. And this year I was able to return into that story when Fatuma launched a lawsuit against our province and tell people this amazing story of this woman and her resilience and what she was fighting through this story that everybody knew. Everybody knew Abdul's story, but nobody knew the story of his sister. They had seen her, on the news. And there was this whole story about child welfare and how Black mothers' mothering is labeled unfit, and the generational trauma visited upon women and how women face abuse in particular ways. And a story that really gets to the heart of how Black women are oppressed in particular ways in our system. So I think about that as a really important moment in being able to tell this story of this woman. The other last thing I'll say, because I know I'm talking really long, is that I've come to understand that there's sort of two parts to our storytelling as Black people. I think one is just telling that story. And it's not always Black stories. A lot of times it's people who are incarcerated. I do a lot of work working with people inside prisons, a lot of work on just all the different ways people in prison speak back and resist, which isn't just necessarily storytelling. It can be things like filing habeas complaints. We do a lot of work with them to be able to file those complaints. And we've had some success now with some successful cases like Pratt that challenge the gatekeeping of the courts and now is allowing prisoners to have their day. And even if those applications are not successful, it's really important for a lot of them to be able to get into the courtroom, to be able to summon their oppressors, the wardens of the prisons, the superintendents, and speak back to them and be like, this is what you're doing to me. So I've learned through that is a form of resistance. Sometimes we're on our monitored phone calls and they just start talking at the crowns because they know they're like listening into the calls. So they're like, by the way, you're racist, and like just have those conversations at the lawyers because it's a way of taking back that space. So there's so many ways that people speak back and resist, not necessarily in traditional ways, but ways that have been termed, the weapons of the weak, the ways that people that don't have access to power use all sorts of forms of resistance. And one thing I realized is in telling that, there's the telling that brings it to light. And then there's the matter of the archiving. And I realized this actually in Abdul as well, that when I had written a story about Abdul, just taking us through the week of advocacy that we had done on Abdul, at the time when I wrote that story, I had thought that what I was telling was the stories of advocacy behind the scenes, that people go, oh, you guys love to get in the streets and disrupt things. And I wanted to show the love and the conversations that are happening. But then I realized afterwards that I was documenting something that had I not spoken about, a lot of what Black women had done, a lot of what was happening would never be told. So now I look at stories I've written and it's like, it's not just the story in the moment, it's that act of claiming these are things that we did, these are things in our communities. If I hadn't written those stories, there'd be no record of so much of the work that prisoners have done, which is actually leading the conversation in this moment on abolition and defunding and these questions. But we tend to not know that it's the people behind bars with their statements. So I find that act of archiving really, really important. And I know I'm going really long. The last thing, sorry, and I'll just say that Abdul told me sitting in a cell with names around him. I always think about this, that as he was being deported, he told me of sitting in the cell and the names and dates of the deportees are on the cell wall behind him and all around him. And he realizes this, and he realizes that his own name is going to go up next. And he always talks to me about that as like sitting in his own tomb, sitting in his gravestone, and believed that if he was deported, he would fall beyond human memory. And so I always think about that writing on the wall. And I always think that my task is to archive the living, right? That it's not to write books. It's not to write poems. Those are vehicles. But our real task is to listen to those who are living, and we owe them our full commitment in fighting for justice for them. So I see that as the ultimate storytelling, not to wait till people are gone and then document them, but to work with people as they are alive, to actually actively fight the circumstances they are in. And when we do that, I think that's our most resistant form of storytelling. Sorry, that was really long. I promise I won't be that long anymore.
It was a brilliant beginning. It was a brilliant beginning. Thank you very much, Ellen. It's interesting, you know, we're asking about self-representation, telling your own story, and just, you know, the obvious passion that you have for the stories that you've just shared with us in a few moments tonight. You just brought them alive for us on this virtual gathering. And I think it's obvious to all of us that when we ask about self-representation, that there is some of your self in all of these stories. So thank you very much for kicking off the conversation. Jules, I'd like to hear from you now. When we talk about self-representation, where do you see the importance of telling your own story?
So for me, I feel privileged that I was raised with my grandparents, and I shared some space with my great-grandmother. My grandparents didn't speak English. They only spoke Ininimoan, and they both lived off the land. And I feel like that experience with them has informed my being and all the choices that I've made in my life. In terms of representation, because Attawapiskat has been in the news so much, I feel that it's not my place to speak to that lived experience. That I agree with Elle. I think, you know, it's so, I get frustrated when I hear people say to give voice or to empower. And I'm like, no. It's on you to listen. We've been talking for a very, very, very long time. It's whether or not people are listening. So I'm very cautious and careful when I speak to other people's stories. My nana and my grandmother used to say that we have to know our own story first, and we have to know it well before we start sharing the stories of others. So I really take that to heart, and that's part of my protocol and my process. In terms of representation, I am so very aware of my own voice and the spaces that I enter, and whether or not it is a safe space for me to speak. You know, I feel like I'm always asserting myself. It gets tiring at times, you know, you're always ready to go and fight. But I feel comfortable with my stance and how I've chosen to live my life. And what's interesting too is that, you know, I've always been a filmmaker, but I was the acting CEO and director of On Dayon Women's Shelter, the first women's shelter in Canada, Indigenous women's shelter in Toronto, first one in Canada. And I used to work at Elizabeth Fry as a manager. So I have this whole life, you know, working with Indigenous women and children. And also too, I've been thinking a lot of this because I'm in school right now. I'm finishing up my PhD at UBC in gender, race, sexuality, and social justice, GRSJ. I've been thinking a lot about gender and what that means from an Indigenous perspective. And then just thinking about my own family, and that, you know, the gender binary didn't exist. You know, we were very fluid in terms of our identity. And I think lots about my grandmother being a hunter-trapper, my great-grandfather being a midwife. Like, those roles were not defined based on your body or how you identified. So I don't know, I just think that in terms of representation, I'm always cautious and aware moving forward. I'm aware of my surroundings. I'm aware of who's around me. I think, you know, being a mom to 4 sons, You can laugh, oh my God, 4 sons, yeah. Anyway, you know, I really took care in raising them to make sure that they understood that the, you know, the privilege that they had in this society, in Western society, in terms of, you know, identifying as cis male. I made sure to, you know, I wanted them to be critical thinkers. I wanted them to understand the inequality that's, you know, that exists in this world. I want them to understand their own privilege walking around in this world. Yeah, sorry, it's a long-winded answer. It's I don't know, Elle, how you're doing it. It's like 10 o'clock at night there. I've been on Zoom all day, so I'm trying to articulate the best I can. But yeah, representation means a lot of things to me. It means everything, really. It's really your soul and who you are and how you assert yourself in this world. And it's the protocol, it's the process, it's everything, right? And it matters. Representation matters. And yeah.
Beautifully put.
Clear.
Beautifully put. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Kaylee, before we move on, I'd like to just, you know, have that as a starting point for you as well, this whole issue of self-representation in your work.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm honored to be here and very inspired by what Jules and Elle both just said. I'm a nervous speaker. It helps me to say that off the bat. And so I don't usually do this, but I'm going to start by reading what I wrote just to get me a little bit more grounded. So at this point in time, it feels complicated to talk about feminism. And I want to acknowledge all of the wonderful, powerful women that have come before me and fought so hard so I can be in a position to critically think about feminism. My mother, Eloise Spitzer, included in that. And she was one of the founding mothers of LEAF. I grew up being breastfed at those meetings. For me, self-representation comes in many forms in my work. I feel that using my art as a tool to uplift and honor my community of predominantly BIPOC women, queer, trans, and non-binary is just that. It is so important as people of these communities that we see ourselves reflected in dominant society. Therefore, telling our own stories is an act of love, strength, and celebration. My work is displayed at a large scale with voice recordings that accompany them, so that you are urged to connect with us, see us, and hear our stories. I do a lot of large scale tintype portraits, and the voice recordings that I'm talking about are unedited. And it is about being seen and heard and represented accurately, which is so important in this society that commits so much violence against us and dehumanizes us. And so, like the other two have said, representation is so important. And like Al said, I'm sorry if I'm not saying this totally right, but it's hard to separate self because we are of a community. We are of the land. So representation includes the land, community, and everything that comes with that. I find myself present in all of the work that I'm doing, but trying hard to illuminate people's voices.
Lovely. Well put. And you didn't sound nervous at all. You look calm. You're in very, very good
I'm not blushing. I
company.
can't see myself.
Very good company tonight. Okay, let's move. You know, for each of you, it's interesting that a central concern in your work is, you know, documenting the past, documenting the present as a way of, you know, speaking back to colonial and racist narratives about your community. So Kaylee, for example, your photography, it rewrites the visual histories of Indigenous bodies beyond that colonial gaze. Elle, you've spoken about how the lack of Black voices in your graduate studies motivated you to write poetry about your community. Jules, your film work focuses on documenting stories and teaching of your community, of your ancestors. So Jules, let's start with you. Why would you say rewriting these dominant histories and documenting the present, why is that important in your work? And I guess, you know, how do you think that'll affect how we imagine the future?
Did it work? Okay, I keep getting muted. I feel like I'm with my sons. They keep muting me. Anyway, yeah, so for me, I don't know, I love documentary. I'm a 70s baby, so I grew up on National Film Board documentaries. I don't know anybody else who did at recess, just watching so many documentaries. I love docs, and it's so funny because I'll just watch docs all day sometimes, and then everybody in my family's like, "You are so boring." And I'm like, "No, this is the most exciting thing." I see documentary as like a visual essay. I see it as, I love documentary aesthetically. I think it's such a beautiful art form. I love the idea of documenting people when they're actually telling you the story, possibly, or perhaps for the first time, you know? I see it as an Indigenous documentary or an Indigenous archive, the documentaries that I do, because I travel lots with the camera. My mom's a residential school warrior. So it's funny because my mom is like very, very shy. She went to residential school at age 5 and then was finally released at age 16. So she spent like 11 years in residential school, one of the most, you know, notorious residential schools, St. Anne's. And she also went to day school. So you can just imagine, she's reluctant about sharing her story. So what I find super interesting, or what I find interesting, is whenever I document or interview my mom, she's so open. It's like the camera's a buffer. It's like when we're just sitting having tea, my mom won't really go there. When the camera's on, I don't know, it's just a miracle. She just starts sharing. And I think what I love about documentary as well, especially the work that I do with my mom, done quite a few films with my mom, is that she starts to stand taller. She starts, she's more assertive, she's more confident, and people recognize her and they'll come up and they'll hug her, and she just loves it. She loves that she has such an impact on people, on viewers and stuff like that. So for me, I think story carries agency. Story has the power to inform and to change lives. Story has life. And after we birth the story into the world, it has its own life. It does its own thing. And what I love about documentary is that after I'm long gone, it's going to have a life. It's going to continue on. And then I get to share my mom. I get to share my kids. I get to share some of the ceremonies. The other thing too, I think is so beautiful is that, I rarely use the word traditional, because I say, what is tradition? Who says that 500 years ago, that's tradition, or 600 years or whatever? I think we are fluid as a people. We always adapt to our environment. We are forever changing and adapting and growing as people, as human, like everybody else, right? I don't like this idea of sticking or getting stuck on a timeline, but I do love the idea of just capturing a moment in time. For me, that's just so precious, and it's such a gift. The camera is just, it's so beautiful. Like, it's such a great way to share a powerful medium, for sure. Yeah, I use the word their story. I don't like using the word his story. Their story. I think his story is just whatever. It's exclusive, but excludes a lot of voices. But anyway, I'm not sure that I'm rewriting. I feel like I'm asserting. I feel like I'm speaking my truth. I feel like I'm not always in this place where I'm speaking to something. I'm just being. And that's a great place to be, is to find your power and your fire within, and have all your ancestors standing with you, because we are a powerful, resilient people, right? So, yeah, anyway, there's a long-winded answer, but documentary, I'm a big documentary nerd. Like, I'm a big nerd. So I did my PhD in documentary. Time to move on, Jules. No, just kidding. But yeah, I love it for that. I just love this idea of continuing on the story. Thanks.
We can feel the love. We can feel the love, really. Is capturing this moment in time. And good for you for getting your mother on camera. How many of us think about ever doing that? Just sit down and start rolling and see what kinds of stories come out. Good for you. That's going to be precious in future years as well. So Elle, when you hear Jules talking about this, capturing the moment, this Indigenous archive, let's talk about the way that you're capturing the moment, and how do you think what you're doing right now is going to have an impact on our future, the way we imagine our future could be.
Rookie mistake there. I was on mute. First of all, since we're talking about our moms, yeah, my mom for years didn't know how much I wrote about her. And I always secretly wrote about her and didn't tell her. And then I wrote this story about her obsession with Tessa Virtue, and Tessa Virtue tweeted it. So my mom told me that she went on Yahoo News because she has an alert on Tessa Virtue. My mom doesn't know how to use the internet, but she knows how to look at Tessa Virtue. It's really weird. Like, she knows how to watch Tessa Virtue on YouTube. And she's like, oh, a story about Tessa Virtue. And then she said she got like halfway down. It's like, this sounds like me. And then realized it was like me writing about my mom. And like, she didn't know what to do with it. And then CBC wanted to talk to my mom, and they asked her like, what did you think of that story? And you'd think that anybody else would be like complimentary. Mom said, my daughter has too much time on her hands, which was like so classic my mom. Like, it was so brilliant. So yeah, I think torturing our moms through our like creative work is probably part of living life, as we like try to trace our colonial histories. It's like both affectionate and also a bit tense, where your mom's like, why are you talking about me? Like, keep my business private. And I'm like, but I need to talk about you. But that brings up the relationship that you were talking about with the past. If people have read Until We Are Free, which I recommend you read, it's the Black Lives Matter movement in Canada, the book that just came out last year, documenting some of that. There's an essay I wrote in there with Randy Riley, who's a wrongfully convicted African Nova Scotian man. And at the time I wrote that essay, there's a moment I tell, so I write the first piece and then he writes the second piece. I go writing it together, telling his story. And I talk about when his mother passed and he came out of jail to go to the funeral, and they didn't even give him clothes. So he had to come in orange in handcuffs and come into the church. And he's from a Black community, Cherry Brook, which is one of the 48 historic Black communities in Nova Scotia. It's a quite small community, in many ways a dying community. Like, a lot of people are moving out, like the young people aren't there. And so we went into the church for his mother's funeral. And I talk in that essay about how the community he stood up to speak, and he's not allowed to come to the front. He's surrounded by sheriffs. And as he speaks, he says, I'm sorry to come among you dressed like this. And the community just starts saying, we love you. You're our child. And then they come up to him and start touching him. And the sheriffs basically stood back and realized there's nothing we can do in this Black church, in this Black community. And they let him hug his child, and who he hadn't been able to touch, and he had never held. Because he was in jail by the time his second daughter was born. They allowed us to touch him and lay hands on him. And I talk about that moment as this moment of community abolition, right? This world that we imagine, where the community just said no to prisons and no to police and no to sheriffs, through this radical love, where they said, you are our child and you are among us, and we will let you speak, and we will let you stand among us, and we will claim you as our child, and prisons and handcuffs aren't going to matter. Randy's case was recently at the Supreme Court. His appeal was successful at the Supreme Court, and he just got bail. And yesterday he walked out of jail, and he called me, and I came up to Cherry Brook, and we went to his mother's gravesite, which he had never been able to go to. And of course, I don't know how much you know about Black communities in Nova Scotia, if anything, but like, the whole road is just his family. So as we're, driving to the church, we have to stop off at every place and talk to this aunt and this cousin. And, people are talking about like who's stealing money in the community and like the church business. And, like, as we go from house to house to finally end up at his mother's gravesite. And then we came back into his aunt's house where he's staying. And, everyone's in the kitchen, just like teasing each other, and people are coming in and out, and people are bringing clothes, and people are like, and one of his cousins says, well, we made it out. We made it out. And I just thought, that is, if I had to say so much of the Black condition in one sentence, we made it out of enslavement. We made it out of these colonized countries. We made it out of our under-resourced neighborhoods. And we make it out constantly every day of this narrative that is placed upon us, and these stereotypes, this violence that we go through every time we're at risk when we leave our homes, whether walking on the street, walking in stores, whatever we're doing. And I just thought in that moment, since one is always, documenting your future essays, because you can never just chill in the kitchen, and I was just like, what a beautiful moment that was, that just tied together the history of this community, you know, going through the graveyard and seeing all the different graves of the people from the community, like from way back, and feeling that line bringing us into this moment and standing within. There was nothing more perfect and more heartrending in a lot of ways than being at the center of this community. So that, yeah, I mean, I think the work that we want to do, or that we try to do, I'm always conscious that storytelling can also be violent in particular ways, right? I think that with like Abdul, right, which I just talked about, his name is forever present in the media in a particular way, and he can never get past that. And we had to, in a sense, do that so his life could be saved. It means the rest of his life he has to live with people knowing his business. Every time we talk about a human rights condition, there is someone living that at the center of that case. I know Ashley Smith's family very well. Ashley Smith is not just a symbol or a name. She's a real person, and she has real family that have continued to live out that. So I'm always, I guess, where, you know, there's always that balance between, I'm going to tell this thing and it can bring attention to this, or it may, you know, shift minds, but somebody has to give up their privacy for that. Somebody has to run the risk for that. And I'm just so constantly amazed at the people I work with, that I'm like, you know, that if I tell this story, you can get transferred or put into SAG, or the worker's going to come at you, or you can, and then people say, do it for other women. I hear that so much from women when I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure you want to talk about this? Like, that's really personal. You can't take it back. And they'll say, other women are going through this. I'm speaking for other women. So I always just think about that as I tell that. Sadia Hartman talks to us about the danger of spectacle, right? How Black pain becomes spectacle. And when we become the bodies that die on the news, and that's what Blackness becomes. And she resists that. Like, she refuses to tell like the violent parts of slave narratives, because she's like, that's not empathy, that's othering. You know, if you need to see our bleeding dead bodies in order to understand us as human, you are missing something about her humanity. So, and she's making the direct relationship here between the telling of slave narrative and freedom, and how we do that, versus, I think of Zora Neale Hurston, and there's a great book, Barracoon, and I'll promise I'll end here. She's telling the story of the last living survivor of the slave trade, a man named Cujo. And many, many white anthropologists had told this story beforehand. And Zora Neale Hurston, as she's trying to figure out how to tell this story, you can see it online, it's in an ebook, you can read it, it's a wonderful book. She doesn't do what the white men do, which is take this objective view, you know, the anthropological view. She narrates her comings and goings into the text constantly. So she'll talk about, I show up at the gate and the door is open. She's always narrating herself walking into this text, because she's trying to show us that I know that I'm here, and I know that I'm telling, and I know that my presence is a witness, but also like is an exposure in particular ways. And I have to take responsibility for how I show up in the text. I can't just pretend I'm in the text for objective reasons. I'm here. And I always think about this model for like, what is our responsibility to our past? What is our responsibility to our communities? What is our responsibility to the stories we tell that, as Jules said, you know, they will last beyond us. And so we have that responsibility to think of them through time. Like, what happens when you don't want your story out there anymore, but it's still out there? What are your rights? What are the ethics around that? So, you know, we are a people that have been spoken for, that were literally property, that, you know, could not consent, you know, could not talk about our rapes, could not, and still can't really, you know, cannot talk about any of the things that happened to us. And as we take on voice, we don't do it lightly. It's not just, oh, finding your voice. I think it is an incredibly ethically fraught area. And that's why I always try to do it within, you know, community. Dr. Lynn Jones, Rocky's sister, always speaks to us about take it to community, go back to community, speak with community. And when you do that, you will speak with the power of everybody beside you, and you're never speaking for because you're speaking with. Oh.
Thank you. You're certainly speaking with power this evening. So we're really happy to have you with us. Now, I feel like we're just getting warmed up, but unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap this up. So I'm going to ask each of you for some final thoughts, and just, you know, just a few thoughts about where we're at this moment in time. You know, this upheaval in our lives. I talked earlier about the Arundhati Roy quote about this being a portal, an opportunity to rethink the way our societies function. So Kaylee, I'll start with you. What do you think, just briefly, if you don't mind, how we can learn from our pandemic experience, use this opportunity to shape our visions of what's possible?
Definitely. And do you want me to answer the last question? The previous question?
No, I would appreciate if you would go here for now, please.
Okay. Just a second. Can you just ask the question again? I had my
Yeah,
brain
just the pandemic experience. How, if we are in this moment of opportunity, a moment of just saying, let's start fresh. Let's start fresh. How do we start fresh? What do you see as the opportunities with what we're experiencing right now collectively?
Definitely. I don't think we can start fresh. I think that by starting, I don't know how to start with, I was listening to the poem that you read, and I was thinking about coming into things lightly, but that isn't our experience.
Mhm.
You know, what is happening during this year is not light. It's really heavy. And I really want to take a moment to acknowledge the immense grief that everybody's going through. And you know, so many people have lost their lives and unfortunately will continue to lose their lives to the pandemic, to systemic racism, to so many things. And I think that in this moment of time, we have an opportunity, especially with how social media is exposing the awful legacy and current situation of systemic racism. And I think that it's a really valuable tool. And I think that we're breaking open right now. We can see those changes. We can see that we can take our power and make changes during this time. You know, it was at the mayor of DC, I'm going to forget her name right now, forgive me, who painted Black Lives Matter right outside of the White House. That's beautiful. Take that power, use it. Like, we all have that inside of us. And so this is an opportunity and a moment to harness that and work within our communities. And also to give space for those of us that are grieving. Like, if that power comes in the form of taking care of yourself and reaching out to somebody, that makes a huge difference. Connection. So many people are losing their lives to suicide right now. This is a heavy time. There is no lightness in this time for those things. There is lightness in coming together in community and moving forward in a better way. And I have hope and faith that we can do that. You know, looking at different waterways and lands that were left less disrupted during this time, we saw animals come back to those areas that we haven't seen in so long. That's inspiring. You know, that gives us hope. And and so I hope that we move forward and stand in our power and celebrate one another and do our part in ending systemic racism. It's been too fucking long.
Well said, well said. And no, and I take your point about the lightness, but not to forget, not to ignore, to embrace where we're at right now. But in terms of opportunity, Elle, what comes up for you?
I feel like I talked long and I want Kaylee to have a chance to answer the other question. But I think abolition, as we talk about it just really briefly, we mean everything must change, as Miriam Kaba says. So we're not just talking about prisons and policing and courts, we're talking about a relationship to the land, a relationship to the environment, a relationship obviously to capitalism for those of us who are property. So we believe in this moment that, you know, this is, I mean, we've seen this is a sick society. It's a sick society that lets elders die in nursing homes because we underfund the healthcare system. That's not going to work. So our belief is that everything can and must change. And that is the path that we are on. And that change comes from the bottom up. It comes from working together to build tenancy boards. So, you know, our landlords won't evict us, to, you know, mutual aid and send groceries to people, to build gardens in our communities. We can do that work every day. It doesn't mean that we're going to get it there tomorrow, but I believe in everyday abolition, which is the work of working on conflict in our communities, learning how to heal and transforming the space around us. And I want to go back to Callie, just in case there was stuff. I know you wrote stuff down, so I want to give you a chance to answer anything.
That's really sweet. Thank you so much, Elle. I just wanted to bring forward that photography has long been a very violent tool and a colonial tool that has been taking and misrepresentation of our people for a long time. And me, alongside people like Elle and Jules and my mentor, Will Wilson, are working tirelessly to readdress this. And in my practice, one of the most important parts for me is collaboration. That means collaboration when we're making images together and being careful to use correct language. I'm not taking your photo, we're making a photo together, you know? And I just want to follow my ethics and community practices that are, again, rooted in collaboration, autonomy, consent, and loving care. For example, if somebody doesn't want their image used anymore, or they don't want it in a specific place, I don't put it there. It doesn't matter that I have legal rights to it. Consent is first and foremost, putting people before profit in every single way. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kaylee. And Elle, thank you very much for making space for Kaylee on that. I was thinking about the time and the organization and the rest of the event that we still have to get through, but I'm glad we got that in. And Jules, some final thoughts from you, where this moment in time and where you see opportunity.
Well, this is, thank you, Kaylee. I think I lost my brother right before COVID. There's a lot of suicide in my community and even within my own family. So, but I think this time, been doing a lot of spiritual realigning. So I smudge every morning, I pray every morning, I live at UBC, I walk amongst the trees, I go to the ocean, I pray lots to my brother. My older brother's not doing well either, which kind of inspired me to make a new doc with the National Film Board. I know, big geek I am again. But this film, though, I really want to touch on the futurity, and why are a lot of our young people not seeing themselves reflected in the future? Like, we need to unpack this. We need to talk about this. We need to shed light on these issues. I haven't really formulated the story yet, but it's this time of grief and pain and reflection has also inspired a time to tell a new story. So that's what I've been doing, is a lot of self-care, and been stuck in my house with my twin boys who are 14 for a year. Anyway, it's been an interesting year, let me tell you, but I've done a lot of work. My goodness, all I've been doing is writing and creating. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm very sorry to hear about your brother that you lost prior to the pandemic, and your brother who's having problems now. Thanks for sharing that and trusting us with that tonight as well. Well, I know this is just a tip of the iceberg kind of a conversation, but you have all brought so much to the conversation, and hopefully it will continue in some of the breakout rooms after we're officially done. Thank you very much to Elle Jones, to Jules Arita Kustachen, and to Kaylee Spitzer. It's been a timely and a very complex discussion, and it's been my pleasure to be a part of it.